In this unit, we will be talking about the issues of assessment in special education. No matter which type of professional you become in the field of special education, it is always necessary to fully understand the assessment process and to be able to clearly communicate vital information to professionals, parents, and students. This is also important because, based on the interpretation of the results of the assessments conducted, will you be coming up with recommendations to help the child meet the goals that have been set for the entire year, and also make changes as and when necessary based on the progress monitoring data that has been collected over time. But before moving on, let's think about why should we assess students? Why do you think that is important? Just spend a minute before moving on to the next slide. So as you can see from this slide, there are a number of reasons why we should conduct assessments. Some of them being that they are necessary once a referral has been sent in. They let us know whether the legal requirements are being met. They help us conduct research so we can develop evidence-based research practices to help students with certain disabilities. It is on the basis of assessments that states and the federal government determines the amount of funding. Assessments help us set standards. They help us assess teacher training. So assessments is not always just about the student. It is about the teacher and the education being provided to the student. It helps us prescribe proper treatment. That is, it helps us determine where the student or what skill the students are struggling with. It helps us determine special groups in the classroom. It helps us pinpoint difficulties. What are our students really struggling with? What do we need to spend more time on? What do we need to reteach? And when can we move forward with the instruction? It also helps us identify the needs of our students. They help us better understand the students, and they also help us determine their present level of performance based on the progress that they are making, and they help us set standards for ourselves, that is, as professionals, and also for our students. So as you can see, assessing students is really critical, and therefore it has to be done in a manner that would be beneficial for the student as well as the professionals who will be working with the students. Now let's spend a few minutes talking about the definition of assessment in special education. We must remember that special education assessment is an ongoing process. It is not that, oh, we've conducted the assessment now, we know that the student is eligible for special needs, and that the student will always be in special needs. We have to conduct ongoing assessments of the student and make changes in terms of accommodations and modifications that are being provided to the student. Special education assessment has to be systematic. It cannot just be a random set of assessments that we select and we decide, oh, this is a new assessment that's come out, so let's assess our students based on that particular assessment. It is an ongoing process, and it has to be systematic, conducted in a specific manner, something that we will be talking about later in this presentation. Special education assessment should be a collection of educationally relevant information. The keywords here are educationally and relevant. So the assessments have to be relevant. They should be assessing what we want to assess. We just can't pick up, once again, any assessment and decide that we are going to conduct this assessment for the student. And in order for a student to be eligible for special ed, the assessments have to be educationally relevant. A student can have an IEP only if the disability is impacting their performance in school. If a student has a disability but they are doing great in school, in that case the student would not be identified as having a special need under IDEA. Once again, this is kind of repetitive, but we have to remember that special education assessments have to be purposeful. If a student, for example, is struggling in math, the assessments should be somehow related to math. You cannot give the student the Peabody reading test when the student actually needs to take a test in mathematics. We must also remember that the special education assessment extends beyond the school year. It is not tied to a particular academic year. The assessments follow the student, and we have to be sure that we understand this. If the student is identified with a disability, until unless the student is re-evaluated again to determine that they no longer need to be under that category, we have to continue the assessment. It is not a one-time affair. So what is this whole assessment piece, and how is it implemented, and what role do the professionals play? For me, I look at it as being a detective. We determine what the problem is. So a student has been referred to you, and you have to determine what the problem is and why and where does it exist. Based on the observations you do, you have to form a hypothesis. Based on the hypothesis, you develop a teaching plan. You teach and test the hypothesis, and then you go back and reevaluate. That is, you review the problem all over again to see if it still exists. You could also look at assessment as solving a puzzle, and the various pieces of the puzzle are student records, observation, teacher reports, classwork, functional assessments of behavior that have been conducted, the formal testing, which would be the IQ and achievement tests, informal testing, which would be your classwork and games, and progress monitoring, which is you teach, you test, and you retest again. Before moving on into what assessments are all about, let's just talk about the three big terms that you will keep hearing. One is assessment, two, testing, and the third, diagnosis. What we have to remember that assessment is the entire data collection process and the results from that process. So it is the big picture. Testing is different from assessment. They are not synonymous. Testing is one type of an assessment technique. So while assessment is the big umbrella, testing is one type of assessment, and then diagnosis attempts to establish the cause of the disability. So once the assessments have done, the diagnosis happens because based on the results of the assessments that have been conducted, you establish the cause of the disability. So we must remember that assessment, testing, and diagnosis are not synonymous. They are completely different. Assessment is the umbrella where it is a comprehensive assessment that determines whether the child is eligible for special needs services. Testing is one test type of assessment that is done. And then diagnosis is when you look at the assessment results to establish the cause of the disability. Now, in the past, when students were identified with a disability, they looked just at the IQ achievement discrepancy. That is, that the students were given just one test to determine the IQ and the discrepancy between the IQ and the achievement test, and the students were labeled with having a disability. However, it's not the case now. Now the whole assessment process is a set of comprehensive assessments or comprehensive tests that are conducted. Assessments now are challenge the appropriate procedures to assess culturally, linguistically diverse students. So the test must be such, the test that is selected must be appropriate for use with students who are culturally and linguistically diverse. You assess students across multiple environments. It is just not academic based. You would have to assess the students during non-academic settings as well. assessments must be connected to the academic standards, and they are also assessments today have worked on implementation of the No Child Left Behind initiative that we've talked about a little bit in one of our previous units. And basically, we are trying to make sure that students are provided with evidence-based practices, and they're provided with relevant educational instruction prior to going out for testing or prior to referral for assessment to be eligible for special needs. So now the question that comes up to mind is, who is in charge of conducting the comprehensive assessment? And like we've talked in the previous units, we've talked about the whole IEP team. So we must remember that the team must be a multidisciplinary team. If as a special ed professional, you will work with many professionals from different fields, and you will be a part of that team. So what is the definition of multidisciplinary team? A multidisciplinary team performs the assessment of children for a suspected disability, then determines the child's eligibility for special education services. So now I want you to think about the unit where we talked about the IEP team, and that's basically what we are referring to here. Once again, the team's role is crucial because it helps determine the extent and the direction of the child's journey through the special education experience, and therefore it is based on this assessment and the decision of the multidisciplinary team that the entire future of the child's education system would be dependent on. Therefore, it is very, very crucial that the team is aware of the child's strengths, knows who the child is, and what are some of the struggles, because only then would they be able to help the child become successful. And therefore, the multidisciplinary team members should possess necessary skills in order to offer a child the most global, accurate, and practical evaluation that should be fully understood by everybody in the team. As you have probably already noted, the assessment process is very, very crucial, and it plays a critical role in the determination of 6 important decisions. The first one being the evaluation decision. It is the information collected in the assessment process that provides detailed information of the student's strengths, weaknesses, and overall progress. Therefore, the assessment process helps us make evaluation decisions. In addition, it helps us make diagnostic decisions. That is, information collected in the assessment process can provide detailed information of the specific nature of the student's problem or disability. And unless we don't know what the specific problem is, we would never be able to help the child become successful. The next type of decision is the eligibility decision, and this is basically information that is collected in the assessment process, provides detailed information of whether the child is eligible for special education services or not, thereby making it very, very critical whether the child should be receiving the services or can the child be successful without being labeled as having special needs. Assessment process also helps us in the development of the IEP. So that would be IEP related decision, and that is basically information collected in the assessment process should provide detailed information so that an individualized education program can be developed. The assessment process also helps us make educational placement decisions. That is, information collected in the assessment process should provide detailed information so that appropriate decisions may be made about the child's educational placement. So if we don't know exactly what the child's strengths are, what the child is struggling with, what has worked for the child, what hasn't worked of the child, until we have that information, we will not be able to place the child in the least restrictive environment, that is, the environment where the child will learn the most. So, very, very critical in determining where the child would spend most of their time. Will it be in the general ed classroom? Will it be in the separated classroom? Will it be in an inclusive classroom with certain pull-out services? It is the educational assessment results that helps of us make those decisions. And the last is the instructional planning decisions. It is based on the assessment results that appropriate instruction is designed for the child who has been referred to and has been identified as having a disability. So there are various categories of disability under the IDEA, and it is basically what IDEA says is children are eligible to receive special education services and supports if they meet the eligibility requirements for at least one of those conditions, one of the disability conditions, and if it is determined that they are in need of special education services. Now let's talk a little about how students are identified. There are normally three ways in which a student can be referred for assessment. One is by the student's classroom teacher, the other is by the parent, and the third one is by other school personnel. So any of three, basically anybody can refer a student for evaluation. The multidisciplinary team once again becomes very critical. Under IDEA, an evaluation of child with a suspected disability must be made by a multidisciplinary team. So as soon as a child is referred, it is required that a multidisciplinary team be put together, and it is this team that decides decides on the assessment plan. That is, what assessment tools would be used to gather information about this particular child that would help them assist in determining whether the child is eligible for a disability under IDEA or not. So once again, we should remember that assessment or determining eligibility of a child for special ed cannot be based on one assessment. It is a part of a comprehensive assessment, and some of the things that are the pieces of the puzzle that we talked about in the beginning of this presentation that become very, very critical. So once a child is referred, and if you're the consultant, you should look at the student records, you should conduct direct observations, you should conduct indirect observations, you should conduct interviews, you should look at teacher reports. The interviews should consist of parent interviews, parent with the teachers who know the student, and parent interview with the student himself or herself. You want to look at the classwork, you want to do a functional assessment, you want to look at the behavior of the child, and then you want to conduct formal achievement tests. Based on the formal achievement tests, you would determine what criterion reference tests you would like to conduct. So, for example, if you conduct the Woodcock-Johnson, which is an achievement test, you determine based on the results of the Woodcock-Johnson that the child is struggling in mathematics. You would then, for example, conduct the key math to determine what area of mathematics the child is struggling in. It is after this that you would conduct the informal testing, which would be basically curriculum-based measures. They could be based on classwork. It could be based on game-based activities and so forth. So now you've conducted informal tests which would help you figure out exactly what in math. So for example, if you find out from the key math that the student is struggling with addition, the curriculum-based measures or the informal tests should help you determine what part of addition. Is it regrouping? Is it the numbers that the child doesn't understand? Is it double-digit addition? Is it triple-digit addition that the child is struggling in? And once you pinpoint exactly what the child is struggling in, you would base your instruction on that particular skill that the child needs to learn. And then while all of this is happening, you would continue to monitor progress. So you've come up with the plan, you teach to the plan, you test the plan, and then you retest again. And based on the data that is collected on the progress that the child is making, the plan could be re-evaluated, and you might have to at times make certain modifications or accommodations to help the child become successful. Now let's just spend a few minutes talking about the different methods used to identify a child with observations. So basically, when you're conducting observations, you are conducting them in the student's natural environment. You would assess the child, say, in the classroom. You would assess the child or observe child behavior at recess, in the cafeteria. So you will conduct a comprehensive observation of how the child is behaving in the math classroom, the child's behavior in the reading classroom, child's behavior when they are involved in hands-on activities, child's behavior outside of the academic purview. So that, for example, like I said, that could be the cafeteria or recess. You would also conduct an ecological assessment, and that's basically you would be in the classroom where the child is, and instead of collecting data on the child this time, you're looking at the environment to determine, is there something that's happening in the classroom that's not working for a particular student. You would conduct interviews. These could be face-to-face interviews or via telephone. They would be interviews. You want to conduct interviews with parents, with teachers, with people who know the student, and you also want to conduct an interview with the student himself or herself. And then you could also do portfolio assessment, which is basically a purposeful collection of students' work that exhibits the students' efforts, progress, and achievement in one or more areas. So you could decide to do a portfolio assessment, and this would actually be a collection of student work over time. And now the other assessments that you would be conducting would be your norm referenced or achievement tests or cognitive tests. For example, the Woodcock-Johnson. You would be conducting the criterion reference test. So if the Woodcock-Johnson indicates that the child is struggling in math, you would do the key map, and then you would be doing a set of curriculum-based measures, once again based on what the child is struggling with. So as you can see, the assessment process in special ed has changed over the years from conducting assessments or identifying a student with a disability based just on the IQ achievement discrepancy to a set of comprehensive assessments. So now special ed assessment today is a set of comprehensive assessments that you need to conduct before the child can be determined to have special needs.